Rigadaiga, KTN News.
Yes, vote.
All right, now with that story, we get to the conversation, and I'm joined by Ken Gishinga, who is the Chief Economist at Mentoria. Thank you so much for joining us on Business today.
Thanks for having me, Kelvin.
All right, now, right into it. When we look at the finance bill, it's now passed officially, and now we're waiting for the president to sign it into, yes. So, when you look at such a story, and now the speaker, Moses Wetangula, saying this is now uniting us and making, and it was first of all a divided house, and now they are together. Does it really reflect the situation on the ground when it comes to the common mwananchi?
I don't think it does. I think if anything, it leaves the country even more divided. A lot of people are wondering, come July 1st, that's only next week, Saturday.
Yes.
You know, how will they get to work? How will they afford the cost of food? Will they afford the cost of living? So it's a difficult time. And as the speaker says, one can only hope the government uses the funds prudently. Obviously, a big part of the funds is in servicing debt, which has been a challenge. But every hope and prayer is that after this contentious debate, the country can move forward. But I think as we think about Finance Bill 2024, I think there should be quite a bit of soul-searching into how are the views of the common mwananchi represented when parliamentarians get to Parliament.
All right, and now before we get to the issues, before we get to VAT and all those taxes that were really contested and debated upon, let us look at the budget and also improving. What do we need to, especially now when it comes to the budget? Is it really going to spur us to where we need to be? Because now when you look at the budget, we have a budget that is getting revenue, more money for government, really. More money for government, and most of the money will go to recurrent expenditure, pay the cost of running government, and cost of running government, where we are looking at the positions. We're also looking at the 50 CSs and their appointment. Now, the budget, the chunk of it is going to service recurrent expenditure. What is your reaction to this before we get to even the issues?
Well, that's a good point, Kelvin. Much of our growth, as with the previous administration, has been driven by public spending, whether it's on recurrent expenditure, whether it's on infrastructure. That has been the standard type of growth Kenya's had. The problem with that type of growth is it doesn't trickle down often to the common mwananchi. Typically, this money, if it's infrastructure, to often go to contractors, some of whom are foreign contractors, and the money is expatriated abroad. What we've really tried to advance is the idea of a private sector type of growth.
Yes.
Because that is where most Kenyans are. I think only 800,000 employees work within the national government, but we have about a 20 million working population. So the private sector is where most people are. So we would want to see a private sector-led growth. That's what now trickles down to your mama mboga, your taxi driver. The private sector is where most people are. So I think this budget still advances growth by public sector spending. In fact, I think it crowds out the private sector, because when interest rates, when government borrows quite a bit, the money that can go to the private sector actually reduces, and you crowd out. So I think as the administration moves on, they need to start reflecting, how do we start boosting the private sector? That's a more sustainable growth.
Yes.
And it's a growth that actually reaches far more people.
And looking at it also, still on the issue, how did we get to this? From the previous governments coming up to where we are right now, how did you get here? What did we not look at in terms of trying to make sure that the private sector, which has almost 90% of it, has very many Kenyans involved in it? What really did we miss?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think it ties to the economic history of this country. If you go back to 1963, those early years, you have Session Paper number 10, And the objective those days was to get as many Africans into the civil service to replace the colonial employees who had gone back to their countries. So that was the priority. How do we get enough Africans into the public service? And that lasted about 2 decades. When we get into 1986, that's actually where we get session paper number 1 of 1986 that argues that you can only have so many people in the public sector. It's time now to have Kenya becoming a market economy, and the character of Kenya now as a market economy becomes clear in 1986. So that should have been the time really the private sector, and in a sense, that's when the private sector really started thriving, whether it's in the media, in stations like this, coming in the 90s, players coming in telco. So that has been the mantra. But still, you find the appetite for infrastructure growth has always been what do you call a seductive type of arrangement, because many leaders would want to have a legacy project tied to them, one for keepsake. But I think what people realize, particularly in the last administration, you can have 5% growth on paper, but if people start saying they're not feeling the money in their pockets, it becomes a problem. In fact, one of the campaign mantras of the Kenya Kwanza manifesto was Pesa Mfukoni, because a lot of people are feeling, yes, on paper Kenya is growing, but we are not feeling the money in our pocket. So we were really expecting this administration with a focus on hustler, who's very much in the private sector, to be a very pro-private sector budget, but we feel it follows the previous tradition of very much a public sector type of growth.
All right, hold it right there. We're going to go for a short break, but don't go too far. When we come back, we're going to talk about the 8% added onto the fuel VAT, which is now 16%. We're also going to be looking at other taxes. So don't go too far. We'll be right back with more.